It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the LG 32GK850F. This video review accompanies a written review which is more detailed. There's a link to that in the description of the video, and also information about how you can support the work that we do. This monitor uses a 31.5-inch VA panel, more specifically an AU Optronics AMVA panel, and this has a 31.5-inch screen size, 2560 by 1440 or WQHD resolution, and it supports a 144Hz refresh rate. The pixel density is similar to a 23 or 24-inch 16 by 9 Full HD model, so it's quite a comfortable pixel density for many people in terms of the size of text and icons, UI elements, that kind of thing. It also gives you a good amount of space for multitasking, the 2560 by 1440 resolution, certainly a lot more than the Full HD resolution does. So in terms of productivity, it's a pretty decent resolution. In terms of the image clarity and detail, watching movies of suitably high resolution and viewing images of appropriate resolution, playing games as well at the native resolution, the pixel density is quite good, so that kind of content looks quite detailed with decent clarity. It's not as good as you'd get from a model with high pixel density, and that includes a 27-inch WQHD model, and certainly is not the same as you get from a UHD model, particularly one that's sort of this screen size or smaller. The screen surface used is light matte anti-glare, which means you don't get the kind of graininess you get on some matte screen surfaces. When you're observing light colours, for example, it looks pretty smooth, there's not obvious graininess, and it helps with the clarity and the vibrancy potential as well. What you see on the video is not representative of how the monitor looks firsthand. What you see depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done to the video, it depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the monitor or the screen that you're viewing the video on. So I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. It's identical from the front to the G-Sync model, so if you've seen that video you'll be very familiar with all of this. But it has a dual stage bezel design, which means it is three-side borderless, as they call it, or LG sometimes refer to it as a cinema bezel. So you've got a thin panel border around the image itself. If this monitor's on, you can see that, especially when it's displaying lighter content, but when the monitor's off it sort of just blends in seamlessly. And there's also a hard outer component, a hard black plastic outer component to the bezel at the edge there. The screen itself is a light matte anti-glare. I'll explore that more a bit deeper into the review, but it gives you decent glare handling. You don't get the kind of sharp reflections you get from glossy screen surfaces, but you do have to be careful about your lighting. You have to be careful about your lighting regardless of screen surface. You shouldn't really have light striking the screen directly. You can see this here. I've got a sort of door open next to me with bright daylight streaming in, so you get that kind of thing. You don't really notice that when the monitor's on, but when it's off you can certainly see that. The bottom bezel is thicker. There isn't really much of a visible panel border. There's a little sliver at the top there, just above the bezel itself, and the bezel has a semi-matte look to it. It's sort of like a painted on look, and it has a central painted on silver coloured LG logo. The stand neck is reasonably thick, fairly solid construction. The stand base has a Y-shaped or penguin foot design, and it has some red plastic there. It's not really visible from the front, but it's a slight bit of colour, subtle bit of colour there. The stand offers good ergonomic flexibility. You can tilt it backwards and forwards. You can change the height, you can lower it. It's quite stiff, the height adjustment. You can lower it, raise it up a bit. You can see it's quite wobbly, my one. I think that's just because it's been used a lot and it's been sort of shipped around the world. I wouldn't expect most of them to be quite that wobbly, but still does the trick. You can also swivel it to the right and to the left. And you can pivot it into portrait, but do be careful when you're doing this. At least with my unit, you should always have it maximum height tilted backwards. That means you're least likely to actually scrape the desk. But with my unit, it would still scrape the desk unless you kind of lift it up a little bit as well. From the side, you can see the mixture of red and black used throughout. So there's mainly matte black plastics, but there's a little bit of a glossy region at the side, sort of a strip in the middle is actually glossy black plastic. Most of it's matte black plastic and also some red plastic. It's fairly thin at the screen itself. At the rear, it's again a mixture of red and black, and you can see there's a sort of red ring around the top of the stand neck, a red ring around the central region, and also the red feet of the stand, the back edge of the stand there. It's red rather than black. There is no sphere lighting feature, so that's different to the G-Sync model. So this is just purely plastic colours decoration. There's no LED lighting integrated into it. This label wouldn't usually be there. It's just for the review sample I've got. Has that label. I was going to pull it off, but sometimes that annoys the manufacturers, and also it's I could tell it was going to leave a horrible sticky residue which I couldn't be bothered to deal with, so I've just left it on. The stand attaches centrally and it has a quick release mechanism, so if you push that switch down it'll release the screen from the stand, which obviously I don't want to do right now, and then it will reveal 100 by 100mm VESA holes which you can use for alternative mounting. There's a recessed port area to the right of the stand. The ports face backwards, but because it's recessed sufficiently, the port connector heads shouldn't sort of interfere with wall mounting and that kind of thing too much, so that's why it's recessed in there. The ports are a bit different to the G-Sync model. You can see that there's two USB 3 ports, and these support fast charging, or at least the top one supports fast charging. There's a little lightning icon there, which means it supports fast charging. That's the USB 3 upstream port. The DisplayPort 1.2a, which supports AMD FreeSync. There's two HDMI ports rather than just one with the G-Sync model, and these are HDMI 2.0, which makes sense given that this is an HDR capable monitor, and it may be applicable to use it for games consoles and that kind of thing. So there are two HDMI 2.0 ports. There's a headphone, 3.5mm headphone jack, and a DC power input, which means an external power brick is used by the monitor, and I've got that under my desk. I've got a kind of a carry system, little cable tidy. It looks a massive mess under my desk, but the nice thing is you don't see that from above. But the power brick's just on the left there. It's pretty chunky. You can see pictures of that in the written review if you want. Last but not least, there are little indentations in the stand, either side of the stand neck, quite near the top. And this is for a clip-on cable tidy, which is included with the monitor, and you can just neatly clip that into place if you want to use it as a cable tidy system. I'm now running Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, and this is a nice scene for testing contrast on this particular game because there's lots of sort of intermingling dark and light areas of the game. Lots of sort of bright lights with much darker backgrounds. The contrast is actually the main strength of any VA panel, and this is no exception. The static contrast, depending on the settings you use, it can come quite close to 3000 to 1, which is specified for the panel, and that gives you a nice depth to dark shades, and it lets bright shades stand out really nicely against darker surroundings. As I mentioned earlier, the screen surface is also light matte anti-glare, so those bright elements look pretty smooth. They don't have obvious graininess to them. The contrast isn't as strong as you'd get on some VA models, so some of them have contrast ratios around or potentially slightly exceeding 5000 to 1, so you don't get quite the same depth and inkiness to dark shades, and blacks in particular, that you might on that kind of model, but certainly you get a much better depth to dark shades than you get on any non-VA SDR LCD panel. Being VA, there are some weaknesses in terms of contrast. There is what's called black crush, and that's whereby shades which are very dark but still slightly lighter than black actually appear darker than they should, and that means they kind of blend into a black mass. And this occurs from sort of a normal viewing position where there are some subtle details which are lost or not as distinct as they should be, whereas if you move off angle, the perceived gamma changes a bit. This perhaps isn't the best example, but basically some detail levels become a bit clearer off angle, and actually in some cases off angle the detail levels are excessive and you can see more detail than you should be able to. On this model though, the black crush is actually minor, and it doesn't really sap away much detail. You can still see some pretty subtle details in dark areas even with this black crush, so it's not as bad as on some VA models at all. Another aspect to consider is VA glow, and this is really, again, very minor on this model. It's something which affects all VA models to some extent, but it's nowhere near as obtrusive as IPS glow. And anyone who's used an IPS panel, particularly one of this kind of size, will know that you get an obvious kind of lightening of dark areas if you're looking at particularly the bottom corners of the screen from a normal viewing position, and it just leaches away detail. It completely eats away at detail in dark areas, it lightens things up and breaks the game atmosphere. VA glow is nothing like that, but on some models it's a bit stronger than others. On this model it's actually very low at the VA glow, so there's a slight bit of lightening towards the bottom and towards the bottom corners, and it's actually considerably lower than the VA glow on some models, particularly the curved VA models of this kind of size. I'm now going to talk a bit about colour reproduction. I'm going to start off with the Lagom tests for viewing angle, because they're a really nice way of presenting some of the things I'm going to talk about and showing them in a way which is a bit more obvious, especially on camera, than if you're using in-game examples. So the first thing is the Lagom text test. So this appears, because of the colour gamut of this monitor, it actually appears sort of a less blended grey, even in the middle, than it usually would. But what you will see is it looks more blended in this sort of central cone in the middle versus further out. And that central cone of more blended appearance shifts as you shift your viewing position, or as I shift the camera here. And again, this isn't so obvious because it's because of the colour gamut and the red being pretty sort of eye-catching anyway. But that's due to the perceived gamma behaviour, and it's again related to the black crush I was mentioning before. That's again linked to the perceived gamma behaviour on VA models. So the perceived gamma is different if you're viewing the central area versus further out, or if you shift your viewing position, the perceived gamma shifts as well. So to demonstrate it in terms of the black crush a bit more clearly, the Lagom text, again, what you see on the camera isn't what I'm necessarily seeing here or what you'd see firsthand, but it's normal for the first few blocks to be blended in quite nicely with the background, with a monitor targeting the 2.2 gamma curve anyway. But beyond that, a little bit of the blocks looking a bit more blended than they should, and that's basically black crush in action. But if you move to the side, you can actually start to see all of the blocks revealed. That's because the perceived gamma behaviour shifts. So that's the sort of black crush effect. And with VA, I explore this more in the written review, but there's a kind of oil slick effect. If you move even slightly, you can see the tone shifts quite readily. And this is again why I wouldn't recommend VAs for colour critical work, but these kind of effects, when you're gaming and stuff like that, most people don't find them bothersome. So back to the colour reproduction. There are also nice solid screen fills on the Lagom text, which help show the effects of these perceived gamma changes and the saturation changes in a more specific way. The purple block here looks a nice sort of vibrant, slightly pinkish purple throughout really, but there is more of a pink tone towards the flanks of the screen and towards the bottom, or depending on your viewing position, could be a bit towards the top if you're low enough down. And that's again the perceived gamma shifts and saturation shifts associated with VA models. On this model, from a reasonable viewing position, say 65 centimeters plus, I think that's perfectly reasonable for a screen of this size. The shifts are actually fairly minor. They're not as pronounced as you'd get on some VA models. And you can see that with other blocks. Actually, some of them are even more consistent. This red block is a good consistent red throughout, but it is a little bit more pink in some regions. But it's a pretty vibrant red throughout. And again, that kind of shifts a bit as you shift your head movement. Actually, the shifts are a bit clearer with the purple block, the sort of pink hue shifting as you move your head. The green block's pretty solid, fairly decent green tone. Actually, the colour gamut helps get rid of the sort of yellowing you'd usually get with this particular shade as well. And the blue block, as usual, is pretty consistent. But I'll show you some in-game examples as well, because obviously these shifts are very easy to see on the desktop or when you've got a big solid area of colour, but when you're gaming, they're not necessarily going to be so bothersome. I'm now running Battlefield 1, and I'm going to talk a bit about the colour reproduction of the monitor using an in-game example. So this monitor's colour gamut extends comfortably beyond sRGB, and this is a big difference compared to the G-Sync model, which extends a little bit beyond sRGB. The colour gamut of this model actually comes quite close to DCI P3, which is the Digital Cinema Initiative's colour gamut standard, which is sort of the short-term target for HDR, really. I'm running this game in SDR at the moment, just so you know. But what this means is that for content like this, which is really designed by the developers with sRGB in mind, because most devices can only go about that far in terms of colour gamut, the colours therefore look a bit more saturated than intended, but it's quite an even boost in saturation. It's not like if you use a monitor with sort of an Adobe RGB gamut, where the gamut extends a lot in some regions beyond sRGB, but it's actually exactly the same in other regions. For example, it extends a lot in the green region, but the reds and the blues align with sRGB. So there's actually quite an even boost in saturation. It's also not like you get if you just increase NVIDIA digital vibrance or that kind of thing, a digital vibrancy enhancement. That isn't the same thing. That just pulls shades towards the edge of the colour gamut, and it crushes shade variety, so things just look, frankly, they look wrong, and you don't get the sort of variety of shades which you should get. But with this, with the even boost of saturation, you get a really nice variety of very lush looking green shades, some good pastel green shades as well, earthy browns as well, they're good, some quite nice rich tones there. Some of the earthy browns they have a slight red hue, and that's intended, but the red hue sort of comes out a little bit strongly because of the colour gamut. So they look a bit more red than they should and that kind of thing, but it doesn't look completely cartoonish or like you're playing on Mars rather than on planet Earth or anything like that. So overall the colours look vibrant, but they don't look completely outlandish and garish in terms of the saturation. And this is the kind of level of saturation, I mean, it's quite a subjective thing really, but I know many users do like to have this kind of colour gamut and a bit of extra vibrancy, but a kind of balanced extra vibrancy as this monitor produces. The other issue I talked about with Lagom, more specifically the colour consistency. So there is a bit of a loss of saturation further out, but I use this monitor from a viewing distance typically of 70 centimeters or a bit over, sometimes a little bit closer depending on my viewing posture. So from that distance the colour consistency is actually decent. You do get some losses of saturation towards the edge and the bottom of the screen, but they're not extreme shifts and they're not extreme losses of saturation at all. And because it comes from such a sort of vibrant base with the colour gamut, even towards the extremities of the screen, the saturation levels are still decent, so it doesn't look washed out at all. These kind of shifts on this monitor, I'd say, are subtle enough that most users won't notice when they're gaming. Because of these inconsistencies. I wouldn't recommend any VA model, this included for colour critical work. I'm not saying you can't do sort of hobbyist photography and that kind of thing, but you do have to be aware that even if you've got it perfectly calibrated, so the shade in the centre is exactly what it should be, that doesn't mean that the same shade shown further out towards the edge of the screen or the bottom of the screen is going to be completely accurate. I'm now running Battlefield 1 again, and I've actually got the monitor running in HDR and the game running in HDR10. The monitor does support HDR, but I use the term support quite loosely. I'm not going to spend too long talking about HDR on this monitor because frankly the support for HDR is, well, there's no polite way of putting it, it's bad. It is ESSA Display HDR 400 certified, and that's the lowest level of certification. So this means it's never going to give you sort of the full fat HDR experience. And with this model, it's a bit interesting. When you're in HDR, you can actually change all sorts of different things. You can't change all of the options, but you can select various different game modes. It's set to vivid by default. To be honest, really just change these according to your preferences. But the thing with HDR is it's supposed to be a sort of specifically controlled thing. The monitor is supposed to sort of support various different things, such as a specific colour gamut, which this monitor actually does very well with. And it's also supposed to have strong contrast capabilities, so it's able to simultaneously display very bright light shades in some bits of the screen and then keep other bits of the screen nice and dark, so that needs sort of a local dimming solution really, which this monitor does not have. But basically HDR is supposed to give it quite a specific look, which is controlled by the game developer or the developer of the HDR content. It could be an HDR movie, for example. With this monitor, you change various different options and it completely changes the look of the image. But I've played around with these a lot, and to be honest, I couldn't tell you which settings I like to use. I don't really like to use any of them in HDR. You can also adjust the brightness. But basically, the issue I have is things just look completely washed out and flooded. There really are no two ways about it. I mean, with these bright elements, what you're supposed to get is sort of a really brilliant, eye-catching brightness with the surroundings much dimmer. On this monitor, the maximum luminance isn't exactly incredible for an HDR display. It's pretty decent. But the issue is not really so much the brightness of these shades themselves, although that is an issue compared to some displays which are much more capable in that respect. But the problem is that the dark areas surrounding it also look very bright, and that's because the whole backlight is controlled as one unit. The luminance as well, it's not extreme, it's not really any higher than you'd get from SDR. And actually, if you look at the contrast I measured using exactly the same protocol I used to test other HDR capable monitors, the contrast is actually really bad with HDR enabled. I got sort of close to 1000 to 1 rather than close to 3000 to 1. Not only is the contrast not improved by HDR, it's actually significantly reduced. So it just doesn't have the kind of atmospheric look it should. And it just looks washed out and messy. And again, you know, if you change the brightness, for example, things just start to look really dim. They still look sort of flooded and washed out as if the gamma's completely messed up, but they also look dim. So that's not a good look. Another thing to mention in terms of the settings available when you're running HDR, there is DFC, which is dynamic fine contrast, the dynamic contrast function of the monitor. This doesn't have any effect in HDR, so it should really be greyed out. It just confuses people to actually have it enabled like this. But whether it's on or off, the monitor does use dynamic contrast because, as I've said, it only has a single backlight dimming as one unit for the whole screen. When it gets very bright, you can kind of see the whole screen brighten. For dimmer areas, the screen eventually dims a little bit. But I mean, there's just no intricate mixture of dark and light, and really the dark looks anything but. One aspect of it, HDR, as I mentioned, the colour gamut. So some shades actually look a bit more appropriate because of the colour gamut, or they should in theory, with HDR, because it can be mapped more appropriately to the DCI P3 colour gamut. So where the developer wants shades to look more muted, they will do. whereas if they want shades to look very saturated, they can do that as well. They can keep everything looking more as they want. But as I've said, the different settings available to you, changing them change the image so much, and they actually overcome a lot of, or should I say overpower a lot of what the developers do with their HDR content, and basically it just never really looks right. So I don't really have an awful lot more to say about that. HDR can be a very nice thing, but on this monitor it's really not a feature I'd fuss too much over, and in fact I'd go as far as to say I'd keep it off because it's really not good at all. But I should also mention this monitor is not at all alone in that kind of implementation, and certainly the ones without complex backlighting solutions, they just tend to have weak HDR support, and it's more of a marketing thing for the manufacturer than anything. I should also mention that I am running this, sort of a bit of a disclaimer here, I'm running this on an Nvidia GPU rather than an AMD GPU at the moment, and that's because my Radeon 290 doesn't actually support HDR, whereas my Nvidia GPU does. Now, the monitor, from what I've tested and what I can see, I wouldn't actually expect any big differences if you're using an AMD GPU, but there is a possibility that the HDR implementation is a bit better with AMD versus Nvidia, because they do implement things slightly differently, and that includes games consoles. They use AMD graphics chips as well, HDR capable games consoles, but I wouldn't expect anything miraculous because the backlighting solution is not going to be changed to anything more than it is, and that is one control of the backlight altogether as one unit. The colour gamut, again, I mean, yeah, it's decent for HDR, but the way they've implemented it here with all the settings and things seem to be sort of upset quite a lot there as well. So overall, I much prefer using this monitor in SDR. I'm now on Battlefield 1 and I'm going to talk a bit about responsiveness on this monitor. This monitor runs at 144 Hz, so that gives it the potential to output more than twice the visual information every second as a 60 Hz monitor. So what this means is, if you're running at a suitably high frame rate, I'm actually running this game at around 144 frames a second, which will take full advantage of the 144 Hz refresh rate. And this means that you get what I call a very good connected feel. So when you interact with the game world, there's a fluidity to your movements. Your character interacts with your mouse movements in a very fluid way, and there's a certain precision to your movements which is lacking on any 60 Hz monitor, regardless of input lag. It's certainly something you won't be able to see on the video, but it is something that many users appreciate when they actually use a high refresh rate monitor. This sort of glassy smoothness, as some people call it, when you're interacting with the monitor. The other aspect that the high refresh rate will give you at suitably high frame rates is that it reduces perceived blur. This is a concept that's explored in more detail in the written review and also in a dedicated article we've got on responsiveness. But essentially it reduces the amount of time your eyes spend moving, and it's the movement of your eyes that actually creates a lot of the perceived blur you'll see on the monitor. So having a high refresh rate is very useful, but it's also good if the monitor has fast pixel responses, because they will also contribute to perceived blur if there are weaknesses there. Being a VA model, there are some weaknesses in pixel responses. There always are with VA models. Now on this model, if you've seen a lot of my videos in the past, you'll wonder why I'm on this particular map on Battlefield 1 rather than showing the darker transitions, which VA models are generally weaker at. Well, I will get to that, but I'm starting here because I'd like to talk a little bit about overshoot. This occurs when very high levels of greater grey acceleration are used, and the monitor actually doesn't just transition smoothly from one shade to another, but it actually overshoots the desired end value, and that gives you colours which aren't in the object or the background colour. So you can see quite an obvious example of this. Now I have to say this is actually the most obvious example I've found, which is why I'm showing it in this particular, giving this particular example on the video. So you can see a kind of greenish tint to the trees as I move around. And there's also a kind of halo trail, which is quite a bit weaker actually, not so obvious, may not be obvious on the video at all. But there's a kind of little halo trail around the tank icon there as well. I mean, the alternative to this is basically much slower pixel responses. I mean, this is with the faster response time setting, which I still consider optimal on this model, even with the overshoot. Now, if I reduce that to fast, it's still there. I reduce it further to normal. Still there to a degree, although it's weaker. If you have it set to off, then it's, I mean, as good as non-existent, the overshoot. However, the pixel responses are noticeably slower. Again, this may not appear on the video, but the perceived blur is considerably increased, and it feels like I've basically lowered the frame rate a lot, but I haven't. It's still 144 frames a second. So I'm going to move on to talking about some of the weaknesses, other weaknesses in terms of slow pixel responses. So I'll use a more suitable scene for that. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 1, and this has lots of dark shades, and this will highlight some of the weakest transitions that VA models such as this will suffer through. Now, this model is actually, I mean, I showed you some overshoot. I started the video by showing you overshoot, and that's because this model does use pretty strong grey-to-grey acceleration. Now, I should mention, I did actually run this monitor with an NVIDIA GPU as well, a GTX 1080 Ti, and I found the pixel responsiveness actually a bit different with the NVIDIA GPU. It was a bit slower. There wasn't as much overshoot, but there was actually quite a bit more sort of smeary trailing or sluggish pixel transitions, a lot of powdery trailing. So the pixel responses are different depending on if you're using an NVIDIA or AMD GPU. And it doesn't matter whether you've got FreeSync active. I do have FreeSync active at the moment as it happens, but that doesn't actually make a difference. If I disable FreeSync in the graphics card driver and also disable FreeSync in the monitor settings, so it's not enabled at all, it doesn't really change the pixel responses, but if I whack in my NVIDIA GPU it does. Anyway, so with the AMD card I'm using at the moment, this horse highlights some of the sort of weaker pixel transitions quite nicely. There's a kind of bit of a, I wouldn't call it smeary exactly, but a kind of more extended powdery trail around the horse, and there's a bit of what I call breakup trailing, and this is whereby some shades other than black, these shades appear very dark when you actually observe the static image, but it's not pure black, it's actually got some kind of purple shades and some slight green hues mixed in with it, and those hues actually leach out, and this is quite typical on VA models, but on this model it's not particularly obvious. It doesn't look like, on some models it looks like you've wet a page with fountain pen ink on it, and it kind of just smears outwards, and that's really eye-catching, but on this model it's not so obvious, but it is there to a degree. I'll talk a little bit more about the comparison with the G-Sync model shortly, but anyone who's watched my video will know that I noticed it was pretty much non-existent on the G-Sync model, because there are some differences in pixel responsiveness between the two. But these rocks sometimes show it as well. In this case they don't really, although there is a bit of a kind of, there are some slow pixel transitions. There's a kind of a little bit of powdery trailing. You can't really see the powdery trailing because it's quite faint, but it does increase the perceived blur. So there's a kind of, when I move, there's a bit of a displacement to the rocks, and that is again something I didn't see on the G-Sync model, because the pixel transitions were a bit faster, and the overdrive was a bit, I'd say it was a bit better tuned. And that's something you do find on G-Sync models sometimes, because NVIDIA are actually involved with tuning the pixel transitions as well. So, I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit more. Another difference you'd notice with the G-Sync model, there's more overshoot. So on this model, the particular transitions here, for the icon above the horse, you get a bit of a powdery trail. Again, I wouldn't really call it smeary. Some people may describe it as smeary, but as far as VA models go, this is actually not too bad, so I wouldn't call it smeary myself. However, with the G-Sync model you wouldn't get any of that trailing, but you would get a bit of overshoot around the icon. And interestingly enough, with the G-Sync model, and this is something that other reviewers didn't actually pick up on, but it's a very important point, with the G-Sync model, if you've got G-Sync active in the NVIDIA control panel, it actually changes the pixel responsiveness. A bit like with this model, it gets a kind of bonus when you're using a FreeSync compatible GPU. But with the G-Sync model, it gets the bonus when you actually activate G-Sync in the control panel. It doesn't matter if it's actively being used or not. Now, the reason I mention this is that without the G-Sync bonus, the G-Sync model is actually more similar to this model in terms of its pixel responsiveness. And I know that some other reviewers actually have done some testing, including Pursuit Photography, with G-Sync disabled in the control panel, because I can see from the results they've got that they didn't have G-Sync enabled, and therefore they were essentially reviewing a slightly slower model than it actually was. Anyway, I'll move on to some slightly deeper into the map to show you some more pixel transitions. So you're probably getting a bit sick of that horse now. Again, with the G-Sync model, there's a bit of a kind of overshoot around the moon here. On this model there isn't. However, you will notice again that breakup trailing around the rocks there. This is more noticeable on this model than the G-Sync model. If I move fast enough, there's also some of that around my weapon as well, but you probably won't be able to see that on the video. These telegraph posts are good at showing it as well. So again, you can see some breakup trailing there. This isn't to be confused with overshoot, because if I lower the response time, in fact if I turn it off, which technically isn't off, it's actually just a very low amount of acceleration, you still get that kind of breakup trailing. In fact, you get what I'd call very heavy smeary trailing, as well as a breakup trailing, and everything just, it's like the game's got a filter on, like you're drunk or something. And I'm afraid there are some VA models, I don't want to, well, okay, I will, I might as well, right, the Philips BDM 4037 UW, for example, that's one of the slowest VA models I've used recently, and that basically looks like this no matter what you've got the pixel responsiveness set to. I'm just going to have to take these guys out, because I can't show you the pixel responses when I'm dead. Okay, so it's like you've got some kind of filter on the game that simulates a drunken person. It's not nice, and some models basically show that all the time, some VA models, but with it set to faster, the perceived blur is a lot lower, and actually makes quite good use of the 144Hz refresh rate overall. However, there are some weaknesses, and these weaknesses are definitely more profound than they are on the G-Sync model. The G-Sync model, for me, it didn't really feel like I had a competitive disadvantage compared to running my Dell S2716DG. I'm not saying it was perfect, it did have some weaknesses and it certainly had a fair bit of overshoot, but on this model there's just more powdery trailing and the overall perceived blur is a little bit higher. You can see behind the pickaxe there, for example, there's a bit of sort of powdery trailing, but again it's not too bad. I'd say it's actually a bit better than the curved 32-inch or 31.5-inch VA models. So I'm not saying it's bad, but it's just that the G-Sync model really set the bar very high, and unfortunately this model doesn't quite reach that bar. I'm not just talking about because it doesn't support 165Hz, which is another thing which I quite liked about the G-Sync model. This one does only go up to 144Hz. If you were to lower the refresh rate, it doesn't really help with these issues. I mean, what it does, if you decrease the refresh rate, what you get is a higher level of perceived blur, and that means that some of these more obvious issues of sort of smeary trailing, if you like, they're masked a bit more effectively by the perceived blur from your eye movement and just from the lower refresh rate and frame rate. But to be honest, I don't find the difference anything to write home about, especially if you're comparing 120 to 144Hz, and I actually find the connected feel and the overall level of perceived blur sufficiently improved with 144Hz that I wouldn't recommend running this monitor at 120Hz just to sort of lower the powdery trailing or whatever you want to call it a bit, because it's not really going to help you there too much. This model also supports FreeSync, which I've already mentioned, and I'd just like to mention, just before I move on to that, it also has low input lag. I always forget to mention that in the videos. I do always mention it in the written reviews, and I give some measurements there. It's pretty similar to the G-Sync model. It was a little bit higher according to my measurements, but I wouldn't look too much into that. It still has low input lag. I've just increased the graphics settings a bit, just to get my frame rate down a little bit. Now, with FreeSync and any other variable refresh rate technology such as G-Sync, you get a nice synchronization of the refresh rate of the monitor with the frame rate of the game, and this means that you don't get tearing or stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. Without FreeSync active, and even if the frame rate just drops a little bit below the static refresh rate of the monitor, so 144 Hz for example in this case, as it falls a little bit below that, even a little bit below that, you get tearing if you've got VSync off, or you get stuttering if you've got VSync on. And I find both of those issues very obvious. I'm sensitive to them. So for me, having FreeSync enabled really makes the experience a lot smoother. However, lower frame rates are still low frame rates. So as it's dropped sort of to around 100 frames a second, there is nowhere near the same connected feel as 144 Hz, 144 frames a second, sorry. And the level of perceived blur due to eye movement is also increased. Now, there's also an increase of overshoot. You can see, I'll just actually increase the graphic settings a little more. I'll increase the resolution scale so I can reduce the frame rate further. The level of overshoot actually increases as well. There's actually a bit of a halo trail of inverse ghosting around the moon now. But it's not a huge difference. With some FreeSync models, as the frame rate drops, and therefore the refresh rate also drops on the monitor, the overshoot does become a lot more apparent on some FreeSync models. On this one there is a fair increase, and it does become fairly noticeable compared to at higher frame rates. But it's not a massive issue, I'd say. I think people would still prefer to have FreeSync enabled than not enabled in general. So it's something that G-Sync models are generally better at, tuning the overdrive. I've already explained that there are some weaknesses in pixel responses that this monitor has that the G-Sync monitor doesn't have, but also as the G-Sync monitor's frame rate decreases and the refresh rate it's running at decreases with G-Sync enabled, it's also better optimized for those lower frame rates and refresh rates. So you don't get that kind of obvious increase of overshoot. Another issue, as I mentioned, the FreeSync floor operation on this monitor, or at least the one I'm reviewing, is 72 Hz. That's pretty high. Now if I increase the graphics settings further, so I can sort of show you what happens there. The monitor does support LFC, low frame rate compensation, because 72 Hz is half of 144 Hz. The ceiling is double the floor of operation. And what that means is when the frame rate drops below 72 frames a second, the monitor will simply set its refresh rate to a multiple of the frame rate. So I'm just on the boundary here, and something else interesting occurs on the boundary, because LFC does not apply itself very smoothly on this monitor. There's actually stuttering when LFC activates or deactivates. So if you're spending a lot of time sort of fluctuating around 70 frames a second, 72 frames a second, you might find this stuttering a bit bothersome. But personally I would like to keep my frame rate well above that anyway if I could, and if you're occasionally sort of dipping below that, I wouldn't worry too much. But if you're really running your game around 70 frames a second, this could be quite annoying. I'm just going to increase the resolution scale further and drop my frame rate so that LFC is fully activated. So the frame rate's now dropped significantly. It's red on my little FPS counter, but it's below 40 frames a second. It means LFC is activated, and it's always activated. It's not sort of dipping in and out of the FreeSync range. So it gets rid of tearing and stuttering, but the connected feel is frankly awful. For users who, like me, who are sensitive to frame rates, the connected feel's awful. There's a massive increase in perceived blur. It doesn't feel anything like what the monitor felt like with its triple digits. And I know I mentioned before when it sort of lowered to 100 frames a second, I did say that there was a big difference with 144. That difference is something that some users would feel more than others. It's something I notice a lot, but not everyone is so sensitive to. But when you come down to these kind of frame rates, if you then go up to 100, it'll feel amazing. It's just the difference. It's something that sensitive users like me can definitely feel. So just to round this section off, I'm on the game now. It's running at about 90 frames a second, more or less. So you'll be able to see refresh rate listed there. Fluctuates along with the frame rate very nicely. Of course, if LFC kicks in, that will just jump up. But yeah, so it reflects the frame rate more or less in real time. So that's a nice little feature there. To wrap up then, the large screen gives a nice immersive experience. The use of a light matte anti-glare screen surface keeps the image free from obvious graininess, which is nice as well. The overall build quality is decent. It has a good amount of ergonomic flexibility, and there are no obvious sort of bright gamer features which some users would find quite obtrusive. I mean, there are some slight touches of red which I've explored earlier, but nothing particularly bright and obnoxious. Speaking of bright and potentially obnoxious, the G-Sync model did have sphere lighting as a feature, which is a kind of bias lighting feature at the rear of the monitor, and I actually quite liked that, and I kind of missed it when I was using this. I'm not going to sort of mark it down massively because of the loss of a few RGB lights, but I did actually quite like that feature, and I would have liked to have seen that retained on this FreeSync model. The contrast performance, very similar to the G-Sync model, and as with any sort of VA model, that's sort of the main strength, but the static contrast fell a little bit below 3000 to 1, which is specified once I'd set it up according to my liking, but it did stay strong, and it was clearly beyond what non-VA LCDs will produce, excluding obviously HDR models with complex backlighting solutions, but that's something completely different. Being a VA model, there are some weaknesses in contrast in terms of a little bit of VA glow, but that was very low on this model. A little bit of black crush, again, very low on this model. But nothing obtrusive like IPS glow, and even compared to the curved VA models, VA glow was actually lower. Another weakness with the VA model is colour consistency. But again, for the size of a VA panel, and from a sort of viewing distance of 70 centimeters plus, as I tend to use the monitor from, the colour consistency was actually quite decent. There were some losses of saturation further out and towards the bottom of the screen, but they were not extreme, and I didn't really notice them too much when I was gaming or just using the monitor generally. I wouldn't recommend any VA panel for colour critical work because of these shifts and the gamma shifts as well. But they were not extreme for the panel type at all on the size of monitor. Compared to the G-Sync model, this monitor has a much more generous colour gamut, so it invites a bit more vibrancy to the image. I didn't find the G-Sync monitor washed out in any way. It had a rich and natural look to the image. I think that's the best way to describe it. But this monitor did have a bit of a more punchy look because of the generous colour gamut, a bit of extra saturation. But I didn't find it garish, oversaturation or anything like that. It was quite an even increase of saturation, and it maintained good shade variety as well as depth. So it had a nice look to the image in that respect. Responsiveness. The G-Sync monitor really did set quite a benchmark in that respect, and unfortunately this monitor didn't quite reach the same levels. It wasn't quite as well tuned in terms of pixel responsiveness. There were some weaknesses which were apparent on this monitor which weren't apparent on the G-Sync model. But on the other hand, there wasn't such obvious overshoot as on the G-Sync monitor. I mean, there's a fair bit of overshoot on both models, but definitely there's more on the G-Sync monitor because it's using a greater amount of greater grey acceleration. But as far as VA models go, I wouldn't say this one was slow. I'd actually still rate it as one of the faster ones I've used recently, or used at all really. So I think it made a decent use of its 144Hz refresh rate, even though it did fall a bit short of what the G-Sync model achieved. The monitor also supports HDR, high dynamic range, but it only vaguely supports it. It's certified as VESA Display HDR 400, which is the lowest level of certification that VESA will give to a monitor, and in my testing HDR basically just destroyed the image. It didn't do anything particularly nice at all. It just killed the contrast. The colours just looked quite messed up. There's too much flexibility, so it doesn't really control the monitor properly. and it's just something to be avoided basically. So if you're an NVIDIA user, I wouldn't really sort of hesitate to go for the G-Sync model over this one. If you're an AMD user, I did actually demonstrate that the G-Sync monitor has what I call a G-Sync bonus, and you do need G-Sync active in the control panel to get that G-Sync bonus. Without the G-Sync bonus, basically the responsiveness is quite similar to this monitor, but you don't get the same colour gamut and you don't get AMD FreeSync, because AMD FreeSync did work on this monitor. No particular issues other than the fact that the floor operation was quite high, and again I don't know if that's just my sample I got was a really early revision, that's something they're going to fix. I did have the latest driver available to me installed, the monitor and the graphics driver as well, that didn't change anything. So if you're an NVIDIA user, I'd just go for the G-Sync model. If you're an AMD user, well, this monitor will serve you better basically. So really that's all there is to the LG 32GK850F. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, as well as information about how you can support the work that we do.